Hello everyone, let's begin our module 5 of chapter The Three Orders. In today's module, we are basically going to talk about the factors that affected the social and economic relations. In our earlier module, we have read how in the feudal society every order was tied to one another or every order was linked to one another. Now, in this module, our focus would be on how the things were changing between these orders, especially the nobles and the peasants. While the members of the first two orders saw the social system as stable and unchanging, there were several processes which were transforming the system. Some of these, such as changes in the environment, were gradual and almost imperceptible. Others were more dramatic, like the changes in agrarian technology and the land use. These, in turn, were shaped by and had an effect on the social and economic ties between the lords and the peasants. Now, let us one by one examine what these processes actually meant and how these processes shaped the relationship between the lords and the vassals. First, the environment. From the 5th to 10th centuries, most Europe was covered with vast forests. Thus, the land available for agriculture was quite limited. Also, peasants who were dissatisfied with their conditions could flee from the oppression of their lords and take refuge in the forest. Europe was undergoing an intensively cold climate spell in this period. This led to severe and prolonged winters, which further led to the shortening of the growing of the crops season and reduce the total yield for the agriculture. This means that in this time the agriculture production was quite low, and the peasants, because of the oppression of their lords, they used to flee in the forest because there were lot of forest at that time. Now, from the 11th century, Europe entered a warm phase. Average temperature increased, which had a profound effect on agriculture. Peasants now had a longer growing season, and the soil, now less subject to the frost, could be more easily plowed. Thus, environmental historians have noted that there was a significant decrease of the forest lines in many parts of Europe as the conditions became favorable for the agriculture. The agriculture area increased during the 11th century. Now, with the increase in agriculture, the land use pattern also changed. Initially, agrarian technology was very primitive. It was very old. The only mechanical aid available to peasants was the wooden plough drawn by a team of oxen. Fields had to be dug by hand, often once inferior, and enormous manual labor was required. Also, an ineffective method of the crop rotation was in use. The land was divided in half. With this system, the soil slowly deteriorated, and the famines were quite common during this period, which further led to the chronic malnutrition. Despite these hardships, the lord was very anxious to maximize their incomes. Since it was not possible to increase output from the land, the peasants were forced to bring under cultivation all the land in the manorial estate and spend more time doing this than they were legally bound to. Thus, we can see that how the peasants were increasingly oppressed by the lords. Since they could not protest openly, they resorted to the passive resistance. They spent more time cultivating their own field and kept much of the product of the labor for themselves. They also avoid performing unpaid extra services. Thus, they came into conflict with the lords over pasture and forest lands and saw these lands as resources to be used by the whole community, while the lords treated these as their private property. Thus, we can see that how with the increase in the land use and the agriculture, the peasants were continuously oppressed by the lords. Further, we see the new agrarian technology coming up. Let us look at how these technology further changed the relationship between the lords and the peasants. By the 11th century, there is evidence of several technological changes. Instead of basic wooden plough, cultivators began using heavy iron-tipped plough. These plough could dig much deeper and turn the topsoil properly. With this, the nutrients from the soil were now better utilized. The method of harnessing animals to the plough improved. Also, this enabled animals to exert greater power. Horses were used, and to prevent the decay from their foot, iron horseshoes were also used. There was increased use of wind and water energy for agriculture. There was also changes in land use. The most revolutionary one was the switch from a two-field to a three-field system. As you can see in the diagram given, in this peasants could use a field 2 years out of 3 if they planted it with one crop in autumn and a different crop in a spring a year and a half later. That meant that the farmers could break their holding into 3 fields. They could plant one with wheat or rye in autumn for the human consumption. The second could be used in spring to raise peas, beans, lentils for their own use, and oats and barley for the cattle. The third field lay fallow. Each year they rotated the use among the 3 fields, which actually maintained the fertility of the soil. With these improvements, there was an almost immediate increase in the amount of food produced from each unit of land, which resulted into the doubling of the food availability. The greater use of plants meant more vegetable protein in the diet of an average European and a better source of fodder for their animals too. For cultivators, it meant better opportunities. They could now produce more food from less land. The average size of peasant farm shrank from about 100 acres to 20 to 30 acres by the 13th century. Holdings which were smaller could be more efficiently cultivated and reduce the amount of labor needed. This gave peasants time for engaging in other activities like the trading activities, crafts, etc. From the 11th century, the personal bonds that had been the basis of feudalism were weakening because economic transactions were more and more money based now. Lords found it convenient to ask for rent in cash and not in services, and cultivators were selling their crops for money instead of exchanging them from the other goods to the traders, which would further take the goods to be sold in the towns. The increasing use of money began to influence prices, which began higher in the times of the poor harvest. Thus, we see that how the ties were quite weakening in the end of the 11th century, and we will also see that a coming up of new towns and new activities which was actually far away from the traditional activities like agriculture. Thus, because of the environmental changes, the changing pattern of the land use, and the coming up of new technology, the peasant they became more economically independent, and thus the feudal ties began to weaken in the medieval Europe. In our next module, we will be further discussing the various changes that took place in the medieval Europe, which includes the coming up of various towns.